We jump into the 1900s, just barely. In the 1900s, Fred Jane, who you all probably know as inventor of Jane's Fighting Ships and that whole series of books on military information, he published an article called The Naval War Game. He published it in Scientific American, and it described the rules and the tools necessary to conduct a war among ships at sea. Shortly after that, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds fame, he was a war gamer, and he published a little book called Little Wars. And in Little Wars, he described how to use miniature soldiers and miniature cannons to fight out a battle. And he wrote down the rules of engagement and the rules for movement and what should be done first and what should be done second. And he preferred that when it came time to actually fire on the enemy, that you load a matchstick into one of these cannons and fire the matchstick at the little soldier, and if you hit him, that was a kill. If you missed, it was a miss. So there was none of this rolling dice to get probability of kill and kinds of things. You just went, if you can shoot good, you shoot good. Back around that same time, there was a popular party game where they would set up silhouettes of ships, and you would throw these spears, really light spears, at the ships and try and hit them. And if you could hit them, then you were a good marksman and you were shooting ships out of the ocean. That was kind of a party game that evolved out of this idea. From the miniatures that Fred Jane and H.G. Wells started, it's become an art form. It's a war game, but it's also an art form. Some people collect up terrain boards and types of terrain and trees and everything, and the soldiers that make up the armies, specifically in order to paint them and make them look realistic, to create a scene that looks great. They don't necessarily want to play the game, they just want to create a beautiful scene, like you would paint a picture. And so miniatures is both a war game now and an art form. Now, as you're going to see when we get into the entertainment lecture, these miniatures are not quite as popular in their military form as they are now in their fantasy form. And I'll show you how this genre has changed to a fantasy motif from a military motif. We're going to Pakistan, specifically the Khyber Pass. The Pakistanis expect a battle to come raging up the Khyber Pass someday. And to counter that, they have built command bunkers that overlook this pass. And in that command bunker, they've equipped it with a sand table. The sand table is an exact representation of the Khyber Pass. And the commanders can sit in the command bunker, move their unit icons around on the sand table, and send those same orders down onto the battlefield to have the real units move where they told them to move. They can also war game out a future move on that sand table and decide whether it was a good idea or not. So they are essentially looking at the war game and the real thing right together. Really clever. German Schlachtenspiel, 1920. In 1920, people were playing a game called Chinese checkers in which you drilled holes in a board and moved the marbles around on it. Well, somebody said that's a great mechanism for wargaming, because one of the big problems with wargaming is all of the measurement and detail. How far can you shoot? How far can you move? That really gets to be a problem. So you need to create some simplifying mechanism like holes in a board to tell you how far you can move each time. So they would create this Chinese checkers-like board and then go out and place terrain features like mountains and lakes and cities on the board. So when you went to move your units from hole to hole, you were funneled into passes, and you were not allowed to fight in cities and that kind of thing. You found those kind of obstacles on the board. Then in 1929, Erich von Manstein invented, for the first time, a thing called political military gaming. The Germans were about to invade Poland, and they wondered what was going to be Poland's response to this, but also how is the world going to respond to this? So they met in a room, and they had people role play out the president of the League of Nations, specific diplomats from the countries surrounding Poland, the cabinet members in Germany and Poland, and the military generals. All the people who would be involved in the political aspects of this invasion, rather than the military aspects, had them role play out what's going to happen. Is this going to lead to a response from other nations? And they tried to understand what was going to happen when they invaded Poland before they actually did it. And in the process, they invented political military gaming. Wargaming was used by the Japanese in 1941. They wargamed out the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as a result, they credited some of the success of that attack with their rehearsal in the war game format. Now, they also role-played out the Battle of Midway, and they don't get much credit for that. But wargaming became a permanent part of the Tokyo Naval War College after that, because they said this is a really useful tool for teaching people how to think about the battles they're about to get themselves into. Charles Roberts invented the board war game as you know it in 1952. And that game was invented while he was waiting his commission in the Army. He wanted some kind of tool that would allow him to practice war before he was actually brought into the Army. And he sat down and he created a game which included 5 major pieces. The first one was a grid system. Today, the grid system is usually hexagons. So if you look at board war games, it's divided into hexes. I'll explain that in just a minute. The second was terrain types. Just like you saw in those old games back in the 1700s, individual representation of terrain in each one of these grids, something different. Third was military units with ratings. Again, something you saw in the older games in the 1800s. Then a combat results table. This is a table which contains all of the outcome of a certain engagement or a certain detection or whatever the operation is that's being carried out. You roll a die, the 5th piece, and it leads you into the table to determine what's going to happen in this situation. He published the game Tactics in 1954. And he was just playing with the idea of publishing these games. He sold a couple thousand of them. And in 1958, he said, this is a good deal, and started Avalon Hill. And Avalon Hill was the premier game company for several years. And then the board wargaming community just exploded. And there were suddenly hundreds of different game companies, small and large. Avalon Hill, being the grandfather of all of them, survived until last year. Last year, Avalon Hill was purchased by Hasbro. Hasbro's on an acquisition. Several of the companies that we talk about in this course that work in the wargaming simulation arena are being bought by Hasbro. You'll see them come up several times where you say, oh, this belongs to Hasbro now. Milton Bradley, they belong to Hasbro. Avalon Hill, they belong to Hasbro. TSR, they invented Dungeons & Dragons, they belong to Hasbro. Wizards of the Coast, they invented Magic the Gathering, they belong to Hasbro. Hasbro's swallowing people right and left. Okay, the 5 game components, here they are on the board. You can see that we divide the board into six-sided shapes, into hexagons. Why do we do that? Just to make things difficult? No. Charles Roberts was in the process of inventing these games, and he had divided his board into squares. And he saw an article in a magazine in which some people interviewed a group at Rand that was busy inventing board games as well. And in the background, in a photo in that article, he saw their game board. And their game board was divided into hexagons. And he looked at that and wondered about it a while. And he realized that if you'll create hexagons, which are a mechanism for simplifying movement, you will give your units 6 directions of movement instead of 4. So they'll have a little more flexibility to move around. And he said, I've got to have that in my game. And so he incorporated that Rand idea into his board war game. Now, the combat results table, he never saw one from Rand. But after he published these games, people from Rand who were building games of World War III came to him and said, where'd you get this idea for a combat results table? That's our idea. He said, I was just sitting around. It made sense. I invented it. He said, they were like, we invented that for nuclear war. We're not too sure. You might be stealing ideas out of us somehow. But very similar ideas evolving at Rand and evolving in Charles Roberts' mind. The first computer war game, where was that? Well, it was at the Army Operations Research Office at Johns Hopkins University. Yes?
Roger, we don't have those.
I know. There is. Those are slides that I swapped from the entertainment lecture. I swapped them. They're in the entertainment lecture, and you'll find them in a later lecture. Yeah, that's what happened.
Okay, all right.
I pulled them forward. Yeah. Okay, the first computer war game, where is that? That's at the Army Operations Research Office at Johns Hopkins University. Specifically, they built a game called the Air Defense Simulation. And as soon as a UNIVAC computer was available, they hosted it on the UNIVAC computer. And it studied out the air defenses of North America and naval anti-aircraft guided missile scenarios. That's all it did. Well, after they finished the air defense simulation, which I put in quotes because they didn't really give it a title, they just said, "What is this?" And they said, "Well, that's the air defense simulation." And so that's become the title of it now when you try to refer to it. They followed that with a game called Carmanet. And Carmanet, it stands for the Computerized Monte Carlo Simulation. 1953, they invented this game. And in 1956, they actually had it operational at some war colleges. And all it did was represent tanks fighting anti-tank equipment. That's all. In their whole virtual world, all they had was tanks and anti-tank equipment running around fighting with each other. It wasn't until almost 4 years later that they added a version that had infantry, and then about another 4 years later they added helicopter and then communications. So the model that lived on for almost 2 decades evolved from a real simple core, which they were good at, and then they added layers as they became better at other things. Lesson learned there. It's really tough to invent a complete virtual world in one step. It usually requires several steps. You learn as you go. 1958, a guy named Milton Caniff, who very few of you probably remember, he was drawing a comic strip called Steve Canyon, which most of you have probably heard of. Steve Canyon was an Air Force major going about his adventures in the comic strips every day. Steve Canyon was very popular with the military servicemen. And because he was so popular with the military servicemen, the military leaders would sometimes invite Milton Caniff to come and see their bases, to see equipment, to see their war games. And he went to see a war game, and in 1958 he detailed the adventures of Steve Canyon going through an Air Force war game. Well, at that time, the Army, the Air Force, the military in general, not really ready to admit to the public that they were playing games. That in their colleges and in their command and staff organizations that they were playing games. A little bit embarrassing. If you've been in this industry for very long, that embarrassment has carried for a long time. Up until, I remember as late as the late 80s, being told not to refer to what we do as war gaming. It's simulation. Don't use the term game around here because it just didn't sound quite right. Well, the Air Force kind of cut back on his access to military information after he did that. But that's where the public kind of first saw that the military was playing games to study warfare.